Africa will no longer bow to anyone. Today we stand as a continent of dignity, pride, and unshakable sovereignty. A storm is brewing across the African continent. Something unprecedented is happening. Nations that once remained silent are now speaking with thunder in their voices. Leaders who once traveled thousands of miles seeking approval are now standing firm on their own soil. The world is watching, and what they see is making them uncomfortable. Africa is changing, and this change is shaking the foundations of global power. South Africa just made a decision that sent shockwaves through every capital city in the Western world. For decades, there has been a tradition in international diplomacy. When one country finishes its term as G20 president, representatives fly to the next host nation to ceremonially hand over leadership. This ritual has been sacred, unbroken, and followed without question by every nation for years. It symbolizes continuity, respect, and the smooth transfer of global economic leadership. But this year, something extraordinary happened. South Africa looked at this tradition, examined it carefully, and said two words that changed everything: "We refuse." The announcement came quietly at first, but its impact was explosive. South Africa would not be sending any delegation to the United States for the handover ceremony. No ministers, no ambassadors, no officials. The message was crystal clear and impossible to misunderstand. If you want this presidency, you must come to us. We will not cross oceans and continents to participate in ceremonies that demand our submission while offering us nothing but symbolic gestures in return. This was not rudeness. This was not diplomatic negligence. This was a calculated statement of sovereignty. South Africa was drawing a line in the sand and daring the world to cross it. For generations, African leaders have been expected to play a very specific role on the global stage. They were supposed to be grateful, humble, and accommodating. When Western nations called meetings in London, Paris, or Washington, African presidents would board planes without hesitation. They would sit in conference rooms, listen to lectures about governance and development, and return home with promises that rarely materialized. The unspoken rule was simple: Africa comes when called. Africa listens when spoken to. Africa accepts the crumbs from the table and calls it partnership. But something fundamental has shifted in the African consciousness. A new generation of leaders is emerging, and they refuse to play by the old rules. South Africa's refusal was not an isolated incident of rebellion. It was a statement rooted in principle and backed by confidence. The message resonated far beyond the walls of government buildings. Across the continent, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Addis Ababa, millions of Africans took to social media to celebrate. Hashtags trended worldwide. Young people who had grown tired of seeing their leaders treated like subordinates finally had a moment to be proud of. Here was a nation that understood its worth. Here was a government that refused to bend. Here was Africa standing tall and refusing to apologize for it. The decision sent ripples through diplomatic channels everywhere. Foreign ministries scrambled to understand what this meant. Analysts debated whether this was a temporary stance or the beginning of a larger shift in African foreign policy. Some called it bold. Others called it reckless. But everyone agreed on one thing: Africa was no longer predictable, and that made powerful nations very nervous. For too long, the West has operated under the assumption that Africa needs them more than they need Africa. South Africa just challenged that assumption directly. This moment represents something far bigger than a diplomatic snub. It represents a continent that has finally realized its own power. Africa is home to over 1.4 billion people. It holds more natural resources than any other continent on Earth. It is the youngest population in the world, bursting with energy, creativity, and ambition. Yet for centuries, Africa has been treated as a dependent, a charity case, a place where others come to extract wealth while leaving behind instability. South Africa's stand is a rejection of that entire paradigm. It is a declaration that Africa will no longer participate in systems designed to keep it subordinate. What made this decision even more powerful was the timing. The world is changing rapidly. Old alliances are crumbling. New economic blocs are forming. The dominance of Western institutions is being questioned everywhere. Africa is watching all of this and making strategic calculations. South Africa understood that this was the perfect moment to assert itself. The global balance of power is shifting, and Africa intends to be on the winning side of that shift. By refusing to travel, South Africa was telling the world that the era of automatic deference to Western power is over. Respect must be mutual, or it will not exist at all. The United States was caught completely off guard. For months leading up to the G20 transition, American officials had assumed that everything would proceed normally. They had planned ceremonies, prepared speeches, and arranged media coverage. Then came South Africa's refusal, and suddenly nothing was normal anymore. The American response revealed just how unprepared they were for an assertive Africa. There was confusion, then frustration, then a scramble to save face. But the damage was done. South Africa had exposed a fundamental truth. American power is built partly on the assumption that other nations will always come when called. When a nation refuses, that power begins to look less absolute. But South Africa's bold move was only the beginning of this extraordinary story. What happened next made the situation even more dramatic and revealing. The United States made a decision that shocked diplomats and leaders across the entire world. When South Africa hosted the G20 Summit in Johannesburg, the United States announced that it would not be attending. No president, no vice president, not even a senior cabinet official. For the first time in G20 history, the United States would be completely absent from a summit. The message this sent was unmistakable and deeply troubling. For decades, the G20 has been one of the most important gatherings of world leaders. It brings together the largest economies on Earth to discuss trade, security, climate change, and global development. Every nation takes this summit seriously because the decisions made there shape the future of the global economy. The United States has never missed a G20 summit. American presidents have attended gatherings in China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other nations with complicated relationships with Washington. The G20 was considered too important to boycott, no matter the political climate. But apparently, when the summit is hosted by an African nation, different rules apply. The American absence was not explained with honesty or clarity. Official statements were vague and diplomatic, mentioning scheduling conflicts and domestic priorities. But everyone understood what was really happening. This was retaliation. This was punishment for South Africa's refusal to play by the old rules. This was the United States showing that if African nations demand respect, they will face consequences. The arrogance of this decision was breathtaking. It suggested that America viewed African-hosted summits as less legitimate, less important, and less worthy of attention than summits hosted elsewhere. Across Africa, the reaction was a mixture of anger and vindication. Anger because the disrespect was so blatant. The United States was essentially telling Africa that its leadership did not matter, that its continent was not worth the time of American officials. But there was also vindication because South Africa's original decision had been proven correct. African leaders had long suspected that Western nations viewed them as inferior partners. Now, that suspicion was confirmed beyond any doubt. The mask had slipped, and the world could see the truth. When Africa demands equality, powerful nations respond with contempt. South African officials handled the situation with remarkable composure. There were no angry press conferences or emotional denunciations. Instead, the response was calm, measured, and devastating in its simplicity. If the United States chooses not to attend, that is their decision to make. We will not beg for their presence. The summit will proceed, and it will be successful with or without them. This response was brilliant because it refused to give the United States what it wanted. Washington had hoped that its absence would create panic, that South Africa would scramble to apologize and make concessions. Instead, South Africa simply moved forward with dignity intact. The summit went ahead as planned, and it was indeed successful. Leaders from across the globe attended, important agreements were signed, critical issues were discussed. The absence of the United States was noted, but it did not derail the proceedings. In fact, some argued that the summit was more productive without American dominance overshadowing every conversation. Other nations took the opportunity to build stronger relationships with African countries. China, Russia, India, and Brazil all deepened their engagement with the continent. The United States, by choosing to stay away, had inadvertently created space for its competitors to expand their influence in Africa. This entire episode revealed something crucial about the current state of global politics. The old order is crumbling. For centuries, Western nations could dictate terms to the rest of the world and expect compliance. That era is ending. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are discovering their own power and learning to use it. They are forming new alliances, building alternative institutions, and refusing to accept the hierarchies that were imposed on them. The United States is struggling to adapt to this new reality. Its response to South Africa's assertiveness was to double down on arrogance, which only accelerated its loss of influence. What made America's decision even more damaging was the contrast with how it treats other regions. When summits are hosted in Europe or Asia, American presidents attend without hesitation. When Japan hosts, the president goes. When Germany hosts, the president goes. When Saudi Arabia hosts, despite massive human rights concerns, the president goes. But when South Africa hosts, suddenly there are scheduling conflicts. The double standard could not be more obvious. This is not about logistics or domestic priorities. This is about how America views Africa. And that view is rooted in centuries of racism, colonialism, and exploitation. African youth paid close attention to all of this. A generation that grew up with smartphones and social media watched these events unfold in real time. They saw their continent disrespected, and they saw their leaders respond with dignity. This experience is shaping how young Africans view the world and their place in it. They are less willing to accept narratives of Western superiority. They are more aware of Africa's resources, potential, and power. They are ready to build a future where Africa is not a footnote in global affairs, but a central player. South Africa's stand became a rallying cry for this generation. It proved that African nations can push back against disrespect and survive. In fact, they can thrive. The situation also highlighted the importance of African unity. When the United States snubbed South Africa, other African nations could have remained silent or even distanced themselves to avoid American displeasure. But instead, there was widespread solidarity. Leaders from across the continent voiced support for South Africa's position. They condemned the American absence and praised South Africa's handling of the situation. This unity sent its own powerful message. Africa is learning to stand together. When one African nation is disrespected, the entire continent feels it and responds accordingly. This is the beginning of a new era for Africa, not because one country made one bold decision, but because that decision revealed truths that cannot be unseen. Africa has power, Africa has options, Africa has dignity, and Africa is learning to act like it. The sleeping giant that colonial powers tried to keep sedated is waking up. The continent that was colonized, exploited, and dismissed is coming back stronger than ever. And this time, Africa will not be denied. This time, Africa will not bow. This time, Africa will stand tall and demand the respect it has always deserved. The future belongs to those bold enough to seize it. Africa is reaching out its hand, and nothing will ever be the same again.